The messed up origins of Marcus Aurelius. The man who wrote Meditations. The book that Silicon Valley billionaires swear by. The ancient text that self-help gurus quote like scripture. The philosophical masterpiece that sold over 4 million copies in the last decade alone. That man presided over one of the most systematic religious persecutions in Roman history. The emperor who taught the world about controlling your emotions and accepting what you can, not change, raised the most psychotic, gladiator-obsessed tyrant Rome ever saw. The Philosopher King who preached about duty, virtue, and rational decision-making, made the single most irrational choice in imperial history. A choice that nearly destroyed the entire Roman Empire. You'd think Marcus Aurelius is a saint. You'd think he's the Stoic sage, the warrior poet, the enlightened ruler who governed with wisdom and compassion. Every leadership podcast, every productivity guru, every college philosophy professor holds him up as the gold standard of human excellence. But what if I told you that the real Marcus Aurelius was a man so consumed by his own contradictions that his private journals, the very meditations we celebrate today, weren't wisdom at all? They were the desperate confessions of a man trying to convince himself he wasn't a hypocrite. Here's what the history books conveniently gloss over. During Marcus Aurelius's reign, which lasted from 161 to 188 AD, thousands upon thousands of people lost their lives in persecutions he either ordered or allowed to continue. The Marcomannic Wars, conflicts he personally led, resulted in casualties that historians estimate reached into the hundreds of thousands. The persecution of Christians in Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, France in 177 AD, happened under his watch, with documented accounts describing how those accused were subjected to public trials and tragic ends, while he did nothing to intervene. This wasn't some rogue governor acting alone. This was imperial policy, approved at the highest level, by the man who wrote about compassion and universal brotherhood in his private notebooks. The contradiction goes deeper. Marcus wrote in Meditations that everything is just an opinion, and that we should be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. Yet when it came to religious minorities, when it came to political dissent, when it came to anything that threatened Roman stability, tolerance vanished. The Stoic who preached emotional control unleashed the machinery of state violence without hesitation. And here's the truly disturbing part. We know he knew better. His own words in Meditations prove he understood exactly what virtue required. He just couldn't live up to it. But the greatest failure, the one that historians and philosophers still argue about today, was what he did to his own son. Marcus Aurelius broke a sacred tradition. A tradition that had given Rome 5 consecutive great emperors. A system that had worked for nearly a century. Instead of adopting the most qualified successor, as his predecessors had done, he chose blood over competence. He elevated his biological son, a young man who showed every warning sign of instability, to the position of emperor. That son was Commodus, and within 12 years of taking power, he would bring Rome to its knees, nearly destroying everything Marcus had spent decades trying to protect. This is the story that biographies often soften. The chapter that gets reduced to a footnote, the uncomfortable truth about one of history's most celebrated figures. Because understanding Marcus Aurelius means understanding a man caught between two impossible identities. The philosopher who wanted to transcend human weakness, and the emperor who had to make decisions that no amount of philosophy could justify. It means recognizing that Meditations wasn't written by a sage on a mountaintop. It was written by a man sitting in a military camp, surrounded by the consequences of his own orders, trying desperately to rationalize the gap between who he wanted to be and who he actually was. The real Marcus Aurelius wasn't a fraud in the traditional sense. He genuinely believed in Stoic philosophy. He genuinely tried to be virtuous. But that's what makes his story so tragic and so relevant. He had all the wisdom, all the self-awareness, all the philosophical training anyone could ask for, and he still failed. He still made catastrophic decisions. He still let his ego override his principles when it mattered most. And unlike most historical figures, whose flaws get revealed posthumously, Marcus documented his own failures in real time, page after page, without ever realizing that his private journal would one day become evidence of his greatest contradiction. To understand how the Philosopher King became one of history's most successful acts of historical revisionism, we need to go back to where it all started, not with his birth, but with the moment he stopped being a person and became a political instrument. Because Marcus Aurelius was never meant to be emperor. He was manufactured for it. The year was 138, and Emperor Hadrian, the man history remembers as Harrison, was dying. He had no biological children, which meant the succession of the entire Roman Empire was his to orchestrate. And Harrison didn't leave anything to chance. He'd already chosen his successor years earlier, a man named Antonine Plague, who we'll call Maxwell, a safe, stable, unremarkable senator, who'd proven himself competent, but not ambitious enough to be dangerous. But Harrison didn't just want a placeholder emperor. He wanted to engineer the future to generations ahead. And that's where a 17-year-old boy named Marcus Aurelius entered the equation. Not because of merit, not because of destiny, but because he happened to be related to the right people at the right time. Here's how the deal worked. Harrison forced Maxwell to adopt not one, but two heirs simultaneously. The first was Marcus Aurelius, who was Harrison's great-nephew, and had already caught the emperor's attention for his studious nature and philosophical interests. The second was Lucius Verus, another young aristocrat who'd later become Marcus's co-parer, a man we'll call Brandon. This wasn't a meritocracy. This was dynastic chess played by a dying emperor who wanted to control Rome's future from beyond the grave. Maxwell had no choice in the matter. The adoption was a condition of his becoming emperor. A package deal that turned two teenagers into crown princes overnight. Whether they were ready or not, whether they deserved it or not, whether they even wanted it or not. And here's where Marcus's Stoic principles should have kicked in, right? Here's where the future Philosopher King should have questioned whether accepting unearned power aligned with virtue and rational duty. But he didn't. At 17 years old, Marcus Aurelius looked at the greatest political prize in the known world and took it without hesitation. He'd later write in Meditations about the dangers of ambition, about how everything you desire can be achieved if you do uncare who gets the credit. But when it came to accepting imperial succession, based purely on family connections, he didn't resist, didn't refuse, didn't even seem to pause. The philosophy came later, after the power was already secured. The political engineering didn't stop there. Marcus had been engaged to a young woman, someone he'd presumably chosen himself, someone outside the immediate imperial circle. But that engagement was inconvenient for Harrison's master plan, so it was broken, dissolved, erased from the official narrative, as if it had never existed. Instead, Marcus was ordered to marry Maxwell's daughter, Faustina, a woman we'll call Charlotte. This wasn't romance. This wasn't choice. This was a strategic alliance designed to bind Marcus even tighter to the imperial family, to make sure he'd be too entangled in dynasty and duty to ever question the arrangement. And once again, the future Stoic sage, the man who'd write about accepting what you cannot control and focusing only on your own virtue, he went along with it without documented protest. Charlotte, according to historical accounts and letters from the period, was not exactly the model of imperial virtue that the propaganda machine claimed. Rumors followed her throughout her life, whispers about infidelities, about inappropriate relationships with gladiators and actors, about a personal life that was anything but the dignified partnership the public saw. Whether these rumors were true or exaggerated by political enemies, we can't say with certainty. But what we do know is that Marcus stayed married to her for 30 years, had at least 14 children with her, and never publicly acknowledged any problems. In Meditations, he wrote exactly one passage about Charlotte. A brief note thanking the gods for giving him a wife who was obedient, affectionate, and simple. Simple. That's the word he chose. Not brilliant, not virtuous, not his intellectual equal, but simple. For a man who claimed to value wisdom above all else, it's a telling choice of words. But the image being constructed around Marcus during these years was anything but simple. Maxwell, his adoptive father, and the imperial court apparatus worked tirelessly to present Marcus as the ideal heir. The philosopher prince who studied under the greatest tutors Rome could provide, who lived modestly despite his position, who embodied every virtue the propaganda required. And to be fair, Marcus played the part brilliantly. He genuinely did study philosophy, genuinely did live more simply than most aristocrats, genuinely did seem to take his education seriously. The problem is that this image became a trap, a persona he'd spend the rest of his life trying to live up to, while making decisions that contradicted everything the persona stood for. The truth that emerges from examining this period is that Marcus was a scheming fraud from the beginning. It's that he was a teenager who accepted extraordinary privilege without questioning it, who allowed his life to be arranged by others while telling himself it was duty, who started writing philosophy not to guide his actions but to justify the gap between his ideals and his reality. By the time Maxwell passed away in 161, leaving Marcus as sole emperor alongside his adopted brother Brandon, The Philosopher King persona was already set in stone. The public saw a sage ascending to power. What they didn't see was a man who'd spent 23 years being molded, positioned, and prepared for a role he'd accepted without ever proving he deserved it. And that acceptance, that willingness to take power based on bloodline and political convenience, rather than merit, that set the template for the greatest failure of his life. The decision he'd make decades later about his own son. Because if Marcus could accept becoming emperor through dynastic manipulation, how could he later deny the same path to his own child? The hypocrisy was baked in from the start, written into the foundation of his reign, before he'd even written a single line of Meditations. The Philosopher King wasn't chosen by wisdom or virtue. He was manufactured by an empire that needed a certain kind of leader, and Marcus Aurelius spent the rest of his life trying to convince himself, page after page, in his private journal, that he'd somehow earned what had simply been handed to him. That persona became heaviest during the years when Marcus actually ruled. When philosophy stopped being an intellectual exercise and started being the only thing standing between him and complete moral collapse. When Marcus took power in 161, he did something unusual for Roman emperors. He insisted on sharing the throne with his adopted brother Brandon. The other heir, Harrison, had forced Maxwell to adopt all those years ago. On the surface, this looked like Stoic humility, like Marcus putting principle above ego by creating a dictatorship. The propaganda celebrated it as proof of his philosophical wisdom, his rejection of absolute power. But the historical record tells a very different story, because Brandon wasn't a philosopher. Brandon was a hedonist, a man who spent his years as co-emperor, indulging in every excess the position offered, while Marcus handled the actual work of governing. Letters and biographies from that era paint a clear picture. Brandon threw lavish parties, engaged in public displays of wealth that embarrassed the imperial office, and showed little interest in the administrative duties that came with being emperor. He was, by most accounts, incompetent at everything except enjoying himself. And Marcus knew this. He had to know this. They'd grown up in the same household, been trained by the same tutors, observed each other for decades. Yet Marcus not only allowed Brandon to share the title of emperor, he actively covered for him, made excuses for him, and ensured that Brandon's failures never became public scandals that might destabilize the regime. Where was the Stoic commitment to truth in that? Where was the philosophical courage to call out vice when he saw it? The man who wrote about the importance of honest self-examination let his co-emperor coast through nearly a decade of rule, without ever holding him accountable, and the reason is obvious. Brandon made Marcus look good by comparison. The worse Brandon behaved, the more virtuous Marcus appeared, and somewhere in his private journals, Marcus must have recognized this dynamic, must have understood that he was using his brother's failures to shore up his own reputation. But the real test of Marcus's philosophy came on the battlefield. Because for most of his 19-year reign, he was at war. The Marcomannic Wars, a series of brutal conflicts against Germanic tribes along the northern frontier, consumed most of his time as emperor, and resulted in losses that historians still debate but generally estimate in the hundreds of thousands. These weren't wars of conquest or expansion. These were defensive campaigns, necessary conflicts to protect Roman territory from invasion. Marcus didn't have the luxury of refusing to fight. But here's what he did have control over: how those wars were conducted, how the aftermath was handled, and what happened to the populations caught in between. Records from that period describe forced relocations, entire communities displaced, and systematic policies that affected tens of thousands of people along the frontier. The personal cost was significant, the human toll was severe, and Marcus, sitting in his military tent between campaigns, wrote in Meditations about how everything is transitory and how we should accept what we can, not change. Think about that for a moment. The man ordering military campaigns that were changing thousands of lives forever was writing philosophical meditations about accepting change and recognizing the temporary nature of all things. Was he writing about the people whose homes were being destroyed? Was he meditating on the moral weight of command decisions that meant some people would not survive the winter? Or was he writing to convince himself that the suffering he was causing was just part of the natural order, something to accept rather than agonize over? The entries in Meditations from this period read less like wisdom and more like emotional self-defense. A man building philosophical walls around his conscience so he wouldn't have to fully confront what his position required him to do. And then there was the persecution. In 177, while Marcus was consumed with the wars in the north, something happened in Lugdunum that would become one of the darkest chapters of his reign. Christians in that city, who were already a minority community facing social prejudice, were rounded up, accused of various crimes against the state, and subjected to public trials that ended in tragic circumstances for dozens of people. We have names from the historical record. Blandina, a young enslaved woman, whose courage under interrogation was documented by witnesses. Pothinus, an elderly bishop in his 90s, who did not survive the harsh treatment he endured in prison. Sanctus, a deacon, who faced repeated sessions of intense questioning. These weren't abstractions. These were real people with families, with communities, with lives that ended because they refused to abandon their faith. Here's what makes this particularly damning for Marcus's legacy. He didn't order these persecutions directly, but he didn't stop them either. As emperor, he had absolute authority to intervene, to issue a decree protecting religious minorities, to apply the very principles of tolerance and rational judgment he wrote about so eloquently, but he didn't. When his governors asked for guidance on handling Christians, the response from the imperial administration was essentially to maintain existing policies, which meant continuing the persecutions. And in Meditations, Marcus wrote about universal human brotherhood, about how we are all made for cooperation, about how anger and hatred toward others is irrational. He wrote those words while people were losing their lives for their beliefs. Under policies he had the power to change with a single command. The philosophy wasn't guiding his actions. The philosophy was what he retreated into when the actions became too heavy to bear. Meditations reads like the journal of a man drowning in cognitive dissonance. Someone who knows exactly what virtue requires, but can't bring himself to pay the cost of actually being virtuous. Every entry about accepting fate, about not being disturbed by external events, about maintaining inner peace regardless of circumstances. These weren't lessons he'd mastered. These were mantras he repeated to himself, because he hadn't mastered them, because every day presented him with new evidence that he was failing to live up to his own ideals. And the only way to survive that failure psychologically was to keep writing, keep philosophizing, keep building that wall between who he wanted to be and who he actually was. But all of those contradictions, all of those philosophical failures, all of that distance between the wisdom Marcus wrote and the decisions he made, they all pale in comparison to what he did to his own family. Because while Marcus Aurelius was writing about duty, about rational decision-making, about the importance of choosing virtue over emotion, he was simultaneously neglecting the most important duty he had, the one that would determine Rome's future long after his death. He was a father to 14 children with Charlotte, 14 lives that should have been his primary responsibility. And by every historical account available, he was almost completely absent from their upbringing. Not because he was too busy, though he was busy. Not because he didn't care, though his actions suggest indifference. But because being emperor consumed everything, and Marcus had convinced himself through his philosophy that duty to the state outweighed duty to family, that the greater good justified personal sacrifice, even when that sacrifice meant abandoning the people who needed him most. 13 of those 14 children did not survive to adulthood, which wasn't unusual for the time, but the one who did survive, the one who would inherit everything, was perhaps the worst possible candidate for imperial power that genetics and circumstance could have produced. His name was Commodus, the boy we're calling Tyler, and from his earliest years, every sign pointed to disaster. Historical sources describe Tyler as violent, unstable, obsessed with gladiatorial combat to a degree that embarrassed the imperial family, and utterly lacking in the intellectual curiosity or philosophical temperament that Marcus valued. He wasn't just different from his father. He was the opposite of everything Marcus claimed to believe in, and Marcus knew it. The historical record is clear on this point. Biographers who had access to imperial correspondence and court documents confirm that Marcus was aware of Tyler's troubling behavior, aware of his unsuitability for leadership, aware that handing him absolute power would be catastrophic for Rome. And yet, when the time came to choose a successor, Marcus did exactly what Harrison had done decades earlier. Exactly what the 5 good emperors before him had specifically avoided doing. He chose blood over competence. He elevated his biological son to the position of co-emperor when Tyler was only 16 years old, making him the heir apparent despite every rational argument against it. Despite every philosophical principle Marcus had spent his life writing about. The tradition that had given Rome nearly a century of stable, effective rule was simple. Adopt the most qualified successor, not the most closely related one. Nerva had adopted Trajan. Trajan had adopted Hadrian, who we called Harrison. Harrison had forced Maxwell to adopt Marcus. Even Maxwell, Marcus's own adoptive father, had followed the system by adopting Marcus and Brandon, rather than promoting biological relatives. It worked because it prioritized merit over dynasty, because it recognized that genetic inheritance has nothing to do with the qualities needed to govern an empire. Marcus broke that tradition, and he broke it knowing exactly what he was doing, knowing the historical precedent, knowing the philosophical arguments against it, knowing what his own writings about rational decision-making would say about such a choice. In Meditations, he wrote that the object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. Yet, when it came to the most important decision of his reign, he chose dynasty, chose emotion, chose the insane path of putting an unstable teenager in line for absolute power, because that teenager happened to be his son. And here's where it gets even more disturbing, because there were rumors, persistent rumors that historians still debate, about Tyler's actual parentage. Charlotte, his mother, had been the subject of such widespread speculation about her personal life that even ancient sources mention it. There were whispers that Tyler might not have been Marcus's biological son at all, that he might have been the result of one of Charlotte's alleged affairs, possibly even with a gladiator, which would explain Tyler's later obsession with the arena. We can't prove those rumors true or false from this distance in time, but here's what we can prove. Marcus either believed Tyler was his son and chose him anyway, despite knowing he was unfit, or he suspected Tyler might not be his son and still chose him to preserve the appearance of dynasty and avoid the scandal of acknowledging his wife's infidelity. Either way, it's a catastrophic failure of the rational judgment Marcus claimed to value above all else. Either way, it's proof that when it really mattered, when the stakes were highest, philosophy lost to ego, to pride, to the very human desire to see your name continue through your children, regardless of what that continuity might cost the world. And the cost was immense because Tyler, as Commodus, would go on to become one of Rome's most destructive emperors, a man who nearly bankrupted the empire, who abandoned frontier defenses, who spent his time fighting as a gladiator, while actual governance collapsed around him, who turned the imperial office into a joke and died in 192, strangled in his bath, after a conspiracy organized by his own officials, who could untolerate his rule anymore. That's Marcus Aurelius's legacy. Not the wisdom of Meditations, but the chaos of Commodus, the Philosopher King, who preached about rational decision-making, made the most irrational decision in Roman imperial history. The Stoic sage, who wrote about accepting fate and controlling only what you can control, chose to hand uncontrollable power to someone he knew could unhandle it. The man who spent 19 years writing about duty failed in his most fundamental duty as both emperor and father. He raised a monster, recognized what he'd raised, and gave that monster the keys to an empire anyway. And no amount of beautiful philosophy can erase that failure or justify that choice. So how did this happen? How did a man who failed so spectacularly at living up to his own philosophy become the patron saint of productivity gurus and self-improvement entrepreneurs? How did Marcus Aurelius, who couldn't control his own household, who enabled religious persecution, who made the worst succession decision in Roman history, somehow emerge from the wreckage of his reign as the ultimate symbol of Stoic wisdom? The answer lies in one of history's most successful rebranding campaigns. A campaign that began the moment he passed away in 180, and continues to this day, every time someone quotes Meditations without knowing anything about the man who wrote it. The transformation started almost immediately after Marcus's death, because Rome needed it to start immediately. Tyler, his catastrophic successor, ruled for 12 years of increasing chaos. And by the time Tyler was removed from power, the empire was desperate for a narrative that made sense of what had just happened. They couldn't admit that Marcus, the Philosopher King, had willingly chosen incompetence over merit, that he'd broken a century-long tradition for purely dynastic reasons, that his vaunted wisdom had failed when tested by the single most important decision of his life. So instead, the story became that Marcus was a tragic figure, a wise ruler undermined by fate, a devoted father betrayed by a son he'd tried his best to guide. It was easier to blame Tyler entirely, to make him the monster, than to ask why Marcus had knowingly handed a monster the throne. And that narrative stuck because it was comforting, because it preserved the image people wanted to believe in. The image of the Philosopher King, who did everything right except for this one unpredictable tragedy. But the real canonization of Marcus Aurelius happened centuries later, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, when European intellectuals were searching desperately for historical precedents to justify their own political theories. They needed proof that enlightened monarchy could work, that a ruler could be both powerful and philosophical. that education and wisdom could coexist with absolute authority. Marcus Aurelius was perfect for this purpose, almost too perfect, and so they polished the story even further, stripped away the uncomfortable contradictions, and presented him as the ideal that every monarch should aspire to become. Meditations was rediscovered, translated, and celebrated as the pinnacle of human wisdom, and hardly anyone bothered to compare what Marcus wrote to what Marcus actually did, because the book was more useful as philosophy than as autobiography, and acknowledging the gap between the two would have undermined the entire project of Enlightenment thought. Fast forward to today, and Marcus Aurelius has become a cottage industry. Self-help authors quote him constantly, usually without context, pulling individual lines from meditations and presenting them as universal truths, divorced from the man who wrote them. Leadership consultants build entire seminars around his supposed management principles. Stoicism has been repackaged as a life hack for ambitious professionals, and Marcus sits at the center of it all. The ultimate authority figure whose words carry weight precisely because we've collectively agreed not to examine too closely whether he actually lived by those words. Every podcast about productivity, every business book about resilience, every Instagram account posting Stoic quotes with aesthetic backgrounds, they're all selling a version of Marcus Aurelius that never existed, a sanitized historical figure who's more useful as a symbol than he ever was as a human being. And here's the deepest irony of all. Meditations does contain genuine wisdom. The book is valuable, not because Marcus succeeded at being a sage, but because it's the record of a man who knew exactly what he should do, and still couldn't do it consistently. It's valuable because it's honest about the struggle. Because between the lines of all that philosophical reflection, you can read the exhaustion, the doubt, the desperate attempt to convince himself that he's making the right choices, even when he knows he isn't. If we read Meditations as the confession of a man trying and failing to live up to impossible ideals, it becomes far more relatable and far more useful than if we read it as the wisdom of someone who'd already achieved enlightenment. The problem is that almost nobody reads it that way, because we want heroes, we want role models, we want to believe that someone somewhere figured out how to be perfectly rational and perfectly virtuous, and admitting that even Marcus Aurelius couldn't do it means admitting that maybe no one can. The historical record is clear about what Marcus Aurelius actually was. He was an effective administrator who kept the empire functioning through difficult times. He was a competent military leader who won wars that needed to be won. He was a man who genuinely tried to be good, who studied philosophy seriously, who wanted to live virtuously, but he was also someone who accepted power he hadn't earned, who enabled religious persecution, who neglected his own children, who made the most catastrophic succession decision in Roman history, and who spent his private hours writing philosophy that he couldn't consistently apply to his own life. That's not a monster. That's just a human being. Someone who failed at the things that mattered most, despite having every advantage, every resource, every piece of wisdom available to him. This chapter of history deserves to be examined, not to tear down an icon for the sake of tearing him down, but because understanding Marcus Aurelius, as he actually was, not as centuries of historical revision have made him, teaches us something far more valuable than any quote from Meditations ever could. It teaches us that wisdom and virtue aren't the same thing. That knowing the right thing to do and actually doing it are separated by a chasm that philosophy alone couldn't bridge, that even the most educated, most intellectually sophisticated people can still make terrible choices when those choices conflict with their ego, their fears, or their emotional attachments. Should we throw out Meditations because the man who wrote it was a hypocrite? Maybe not. Should we stop pretending that Marcus Aurelius was anything other than a deeply flawed human being who left us a record of his own failures disguised as wisdom? Absolutely.